stomach. Push him on the ground. Boom, get out here. Trey, other dude, Purser, he walked up to him or whatever, and then Trey, doing dirty boxing, they clicked up. Trey now hit him in the nose a couple times, boom, boom. Dude wanted that he tried to clinch. And I think they went for like 40 seconds or something like that or whatever, and then they called the fight off. But he just whooped two.
Avoid the gas. Get to the safe zone.
Nothing, bro. It was so funny, bro. He was like dropping them, dude. And Trey's big, Trey, like 6 foot something, like, something, but he cut. He used to play football and stuff like that or whatever.
Damn.
He's probably really good, you know what I mean? But he's cool though, he's cool, bro. He's not like a hothead or anything. He just been through a lot of shit, bro.
Yeah. I was like, Trey, you still got it, bro. Well, I ain't never lost it, bro. Oh, shit.
Oh, where are we going? Oh, right in that building? Okay. Because they're already landing on that gas.
Well, shit, you on the ground, ain't you?
I'm in this building right here.
Yeah, I ain't gonna make it that far. I'm just gonna drop right here.
I have a red access card.
Targets are up. Get to
Alright, let's get out of here.
I got somebody on me.
Get out of there. I can't help.
Somebody's on me.
Get your ass up out of there.
I'm out of there. Retreating out.
Oh, this is the worst shot. This is the worst shit ever. Damn.
What happened, Tex? I died.
Teammate has entered the gulag. Surviving earns the redeployment.
I mean, I guess y'all were a little bit split apart then. Yeah, I was on that page, but I didn't see the scam. Nah, they laying right on that scam. With the one that I marked, they were on it way before I could possibly dream. Well, at least I got one kill there. This is a bull pump right here. So this works. Pistol's great. Technically, the Odin is a bull pump, isn't it? Chris?
No, I don't think so.
In a design sense.
Teammate redeploying to the AO.
Well, yeah, kinda.
Coming back, boys. Coming back. I'm just posted up.
Wait, is there no vehicle anymore?
What's the vehicle?
Enemy UAV overhead.
Did they really pick up the vehicle? Wow.
They might have.
No, look, I don't see any on the map anymore. I guess they must have took it out.
Gas is moving.
Fucking assholes, dude.
This is the slowest fucking sniper rifle, yo. That Rytec? Oh my god.
Man, why do we need a trophy system if there's no vehicle anymore?
How much money we got? We broke as fuck. All this shit didn't hit. I need to go get some money.
Need to get some money.
Our team's in the safe zone.
Enemy UAV overhead. Enemy UAV overhead.
The fuck?
He's right over there. Yep, laser.
Awesome.
Laser.
Taking effective fire.
Laser, dude.
Okay.
Yeah.
You guys, if you die, man, we gotta protect these kids, man.
That dude was a
What?
laser, bro.
What?
Wait. Don't back out.
Getting contact.
Oh, wait, you gotta... I wanted to see those kids, man, too.
Yeah, cause I lit his ass up. I don't even know how he killed me.
Welcome to the Gulag. If you survive, you earn your freedom.
Yeah, like what the
Fight to kick it off.
fuck?
Get yourself sorted. You're up next. Listen up, soldier. Win here and you return to the front line. But if you lose,
Really
you're
do.
done. Time to earn your freedom, soldier.
Damn, you're way out there.
Damn.
Oh, man, there's no point of grabbing the what you call it.
You gave him a proper killing. Stand by for redeployment.
Yeah, if you don't have any vehicles, like, what the hell is the point for a supply run? Why do you even have that in your game?
Hey, you guys
I'm off
have
this
gear?
way.
No. Or have gear?
Going this way.
One of these two?
I'm off this way.
Why you want us to head over there? We gotta get you back.
Supply run contract, Mark. Supply run contract.
No, I'm not doing that. We'll just do it
Nah, ain't no vehicles around.
Do a recon.
Damn. Hey, matter of fact, if you could pick that up, I could float to it.
Yeah. Yep.
Just
And we can.
no, not the recon. Not the recon, bro.
I don't
Does
know,
anyone
man.
want this?
You should just
I don't
pick
know
up the
right now.
supply run. Oh my
I
god.
had a red access card too.
You had a red access card.
I told y'all that.
Now they got a red access card.
That sucks, man.
Yesterday was fine. I was playing WarZone and vehicles and everything. Like we're in fan lobby.
Loadout drop headed your way.
You got enough to get them back.
Gas is inbound. Marking new safe zone.
We'll get that load out.
I got a cluster, so.
Positive ID on the bounty target. Sort them out.
Yeah, let's go after that bounty. I want some kills anyway. Let's get that loot out and go after a bounty.
Gotta be careful though.
Yeah.
Right here.
Looking out. Going MP5. Right into.
There guys around you.
You guys got any SMG ammo?
Yeah.
Oh, right over there.
Contact.
Oh, holder. Any SMG ammo?
Oh fuck. Damn, I did not know that was him. Fuck. Missed.
Some SMG ammo, if you can.
Got his armor.
I'm down.
You down him? Oh,
Hold on a sec.
We're in the safe zone. Get ready for
behind you.
Oh my gosh, right there. Oh my gosh, really?
Rounds incoming.
Enemy UAV overhead. Allied cluster strike inbound.
Yeah. What? Oh my god, dude.
Get out of there, get in the building. Go, 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 go.
Yeah, I don't have no more shields.
Alright, fall back. Fall back. Get out of here, get out of here.
No, I'm not doing that. Fuck that. What?
Where?
Bruh, wow.
Okay.
Fucking minigun? That shit ain't got no recoil. Motherfucker hit me with a fucking minigun. Unbelievable. And he ran over there with that shit like it was a SMG or something.
Wow. You hate to see it.
Wait till my controller charge up though.
Hey. I don't know when you...
Enemy dropping into the AR. Get yourself a proper warm-up. We'll be deployed soon. Suggest you get moving.
What the fuck?
Oh, you're putting in the code? Oh my god. Wow. Hey, yo, Chris.
Yeah, I know.
You got the code, bruh. Here. We're in. Hit it.
Damn.
Nice. Yeah, we're gonna take all of that. Oh my goodness, just money hungry. There's gonna be scraps for you when you get in here.
I know you better save me a red box. Oh, wow.
I told you.
Found the body armor.
What you want, bro?
You got it.
Yeah, look. You know there's an armor piece.
Yeah, I need
Found
that.
the body armor.
You mean the ammunition box? No, armor. Oh, there's more back here. Oh, there's a vest right there. I didn't take everything from it. This down. I don't want that much gas. I'll take it anyway.
Oh, hold on. Oh, shit.
Get in contact.
What's the other one?
Alright.
Got gas moving in.
My back's hurting, fellas. I know. I mean, you might as well just put that in your motto on your freaking profile. I know, right? Might as well just do it, dude. Get it over with.
You've got a loadout drop inbound.
I don't wanna wait. All of the go to.
Get to the safe zone.
Enemy UAV overhead.
Planting Claymore.
I already got that. I heard somebody playing a Claymore.
That was me.
I heard that too. Oh, it's a fire right there, of course.
Enemy UAV overhead.
Oh, shit.
Oh, back off.
Oh,
Oh, shit.
oh, right there.
Contact.
Oh, what the
Down
fuck?
one of them. Down two of them.
All right, hold on.
Got him. I think the other one's in this building. He is.
He's in your building? Nope.
Yep.
I see movement.
Oh.
Team fucked up. Okay. They're coming in. Travel.
Be advised, enemy team is tracking your location.
On me. On me. On me.
Enemy
Sorry,
recon
left.
drone in
He's
your
running.
area.
He's running.
Nah, he's on a recon drone. He's in a corner
No, he's
somewhere.
not. He's running. Look at the map. He's running. He grabbed the king and ran. Oh, okay.
Nah, I just got spotted by the recon.
Well, that must be somewhere outside. That's a different team. That's the team that's tracking our boy. Yeah. Wait, what the hell? Oh, okay, no, that's not it. Nothing.
Y'all up? Are y'all upstairs?
No, they're not. They're not. Those are decoys. They're inside the building.
Enemy UAV overhead.
Oh my gosh, bro. These dudes are trolling. They're down there.
Yeah, they about to buy. Yeah, he just bought a loadout.
I don't have any more armor.
Those are the same dudes.
Friendly precision airstrike inbound.
Damn, they all over here. They all went back to the fire station. Oh, wow.
Move that! There, I'm going for that.
I need armor.
You've got a loadout drop inbound.
I gotta go buy armor at the boss station. Man, I'm dead. I did not even play that more at all. Sorry, guys. My bad.
Fuck.
Welcome to the Gulag. If you survive, you earn your freedom. You win this fight and you return to the front line. But if you lose, you're done here. You're up, soldier. Now go sort this
Can I get the
fucker
loadout?
out.
Did I or no? I don't know.
Oh, wow.
We're sending you back to base.
Not try you or anything. I can't hear
It's
you.
not
I'm
over yet.
dropping on the
Your team
loadout.
can
Do or
still
not.
buy your
I don't
release.
care. Team up here. Can I get you on the skipper?
Right there.
They're shooting at me. Right there. Gotta go. I'm retreating, getting money, so I can buy him back.
Jailbreak. All prisoners
Oh,
will redeploy
jailbreak.
to the
There we
AO.
go.
Stand by.
Talk about... We got a long run. Yeah, I'm running. Got a buy station coming up. I'll try to hit it. No capitaloids.
You've done your time, soldier. Now get back out there.
Let's see if I can get this down here.
Objective
No,
updated. Secure that position. Enemy recon
drone.
drone in your area. Enemy UAV overhead.
Do I got time? Yeah. Technically? Slow right now. Well, where's our boy at? What's he doing? Dude, he's in the middle of the street. Oh, they're right on it. They're right on it, bro.
Target spotted.
We gotta get inside the circle. We can't be out here.
Yeah, fuck that shit.
I'm popping it off. I don't care. Fuck.
Just use me as a distraction. Use me as a distraction. I'm pointing them out.
Get out of
Don't be
there,
scary,
man.
you guys. Don't be scary. Don't be scary, bro.
Contact!
I don't even have
Oh my
no
god, you
weapon.
guys are all scary.
Right there.
They're literally just...
I have a pistol. Like, what the
I'm
fuck?
trying to get him. Dude, I need you. I need you,
Target
man.
spotted!
Get out of there, dude. You're gonna...
I have a pistol and a
Don't worry,
shotgun.
I'm not getting out of here. Not getting out of here.
You about to die then.
Recon intel secure. Solid work.
Fuck.
Oh, yep, and they found me too. I mean, there's another team. Oh, wow.
Yup.
Oh, they got me.
Your teammates in the gulag. If they survive, they can redeploy.
This boy still got a pistol. Damn. Crazy.
Supply run contract mark.
Did they take the vehicles out
Teammate
for real?
redeployed to the AO.
Oh,
Bounty target identified. Slot the bastard. Enemy UAV overhead.
Bro, nothing but shotguns. Oh, fuck. Ah.
Really got me, bro? Are you kidding me?
Ah.
Hey, you got him, though. You got him.
Yo, I know he was mad as fuck.
More hard out there. Turn your face to fever.
you turned down, babe?
Enemy dropping into the AO. Get yourself sorted. Deploying shortly. Enemy dropping into the AO. Enemy dropping into the AO. Playtime's over, mate. You're going to the war zone. Battle Royale. You've got gas closing in fast. Get to the safe zone.
Alright, where we
That's
drop?
the landing zone!
Alright.
Don't miss!
Get it.
Let the bodies hit the floor. Let the bodies hit the floor. The bodies hit the floor. Here.
Eliminate all targets in the AO. Supply box marked. Secure the package. Hostile dropping into the area. Watch the skies.
So does the code ever change text?
Huh?
No, it doesn't. You said it does or it doesn't?
Enemy UAV overhead.
What's the code?
Those guys behind. What the fuck? Hold on.
What the hell?
Hold on.
Thank God. Are you guys sincere? This is how y'all do y'all playing leader like this? Hey!
Oh
I had my
man.
first day back in the WarZone and y'all gonna treat me like this.
Yo, that shit was funny.
Does anyone want this?
Treat me like a
Does anyone
dirty
want
bum.
Yeah, I got one.
Nah, man. My buddy. Alright, bro. So this gun is hot trash. Definitely not. So just funny.
I was gonna wait for you to say something.
Where was he at? Did they just like?
Yeah,
run
they
up
came in
behind
through the
us?
back. Yeah, they
Yeah.
dropped late.
Yeah, did you hear the bouncer? He's like, enemy is dropping.
We've got gas moving in.
They didn't say that for me. Oh, said it for me.
Yeah, I heard it. I just didn't see where they landed.
Objectives updated. Move to the next
Maybe I missed
location.
it, but I don't know.
That shit in the fuck?
Contract updated. New objective identified.
Oh shit. I saw a guy in here. He came right here and then fell down on the lake. What the hell? Where the hell did he go?
We should head for the safe zone.
All supply boxes found. Solid work.
Body armor here.
Can't look, I'm blind. What?
Your teammate has been designated as a high-value target. Guard him at all costs.
Alright, boys, let's go here.
Vendor here if you need equipment.
Alright.
I got a loadout.
Drop it down towards us then. Still. Oh, I see some Fighting going on.
Contact!
Okay. Oh wait, let me see if I can get a kill.
Be advised, friendly precision airstrike inbound.
Hey, I'm about to drop this loadout.
Drop it over here. Okay, Dad. Okay. Okay, come behind me. Up! Up, what? Up!
Got a loadout drop inbound.
Family drop it on the bag. Drop this bag on your head. What you wanna do? Let's go. And I got ghost on you, jit. Oh, we gotta hurry, we gotta go, can't stay. Can't stay, gotta go right now. Running for our lives. About to get shot at. 3, 2, 1. Out of this shit.
You've got a loadout drop inbound.
I just want to scope it out. Let's see who's over there.
You successfully defended your teammate.
Shit.
Move that!
Gas is moving in.
inside.
New safe zone located.
Might go see who had this loadout.
Big nuts.
Nah, ain't nobody over here.
Move that!
I'm getting shot at.
There.
Tall
Go.
building. Oh, I see him right here.
Contact!
Fuck, I missed him. They're over here beside me.
Down one.
Target marked.
They're on me.
Send it.
This is loader 2-0. Good copy. Buster strike away.
Down another one.
Dude, this dude was pissed. He was like, no way. He pushed me. Tried to push me. Gave me a kill. Where's we gonna take him?
They still up on that building out there.
Gas is inbound.
They are. Still up on that building behind us. So they're gonna have to push up and they're gonna be on top of these buildings, so we need to keep pushing forward. Before we get caught in the mix. Oh, I got 10 grand as well. Oof, that's tough.
Windows closing. Get to safety.
On self-revive. Tex, you gotta help us out. Where are we gonna be set up for the win?
Why are you asking me?
Changing position.
You should know. You're the big star here. You're the leader.
Oh wow. I don't have the
Supply
gold star
box
beside my
identified.
name. I'm
Marking
sorry.
location now.
I don't have a gold star on my name. What the hell? What's right beside your name? Yeah, bud. You know what that means?
I'm a star. You're
You're the team leader, bro. The team leader right now.
I'm being team leader.
Contract updated. New objective identified.
Wow. Wait, what the hell? Why did that one? Wow.
I don't know
Alright,
about
Chris,
that.
I guess you're the team leader here. You gotta get some good positioning. That's kind of weird.
I'm rotating on that green marker.
10, boy.
What the fuck? Oh, shit.
I think you missed that airstream.
Yeah, keep it moving.
Requesting recon on my position.
There he is.
Alright.
Right, inbound.
There. Go.
I'm what you say.
You around this building?
Moving.
Yeah, I'm what you say. Got him.
Be advised, UAV is
There's
bingo
another one
fuel.
probably going
RTB
on.
for resupply.
Contract failed. Objectives out of range.
And I fucked you up. You pissed. We're getting shot at right now. They know
Yeah.
exactly where we're at.
Well, I'm going all the way on the outside. Right side. Going. Moving. See you guys. Bye guys.
Alright.
Love you.
I'm running.
Damn, man.
Looks like we're clean over here.
Gas is moving in. New safe zone located.
Oh my gosh, bro. You?
What? What does it? Yeah.
Where's another box?
I just vacuumed it.
Alright, I'm back.
Anyways, baby, you put it right there. And where's that thing? Remember?
What thing? What are you talking about?
That sticky thing. Roll. Yeah, just get.
Oh my god.
I know, but just do that on the shirt in the back of it, and then, you know.
Positive ID on the bounty
Oh
target.
my
Sort them
gosh,
out.
they're right there.
On the hill? On the hill?
Yeah.
Careful. I'm pushing it.
Yeah.
Alright. Oh. How'd you get knocked?
I don't know. Sniper.
Gas is inbound.
What'd you get knocked by? We gotta get out of here, dude. Where's this
He's
kid
behind
at?
us. He's behind us.
Hostile dropping into the area. Watch the skies.
Yeah, but his boys is behind us. That's where you got shot from. Fuck.
Get to the safe zone.
He's right over here.
Contact.
Oh, yeah. Oh, yeah.
Found some
Come
tactical
on.
here.
Keep that shit one more
He has to
time.
come out.
Yep.
Behind us? Behind
Yep.
us?
Wait.
Yep, behind us.
I see movement.
Oh, I just got sniped. All survivors are moving up around the building to the right. Around the building to the right.
Fuck! God damn it.
They're moving up. Come on. I got him.
inbound. Well done.
We gotta move.
What the fuck? Bro, how the fuck?
Won't let you go. Come on. Throwing smoke.
No way he pushed up that damn fast.
Run. Oh my god, why did I get up on top of the front, dude?
Oh
What
my
is up with
god.
this? Oh, he's behind us.
Shot!
Yes, I know. We're trying to run. Keep pushing that circle though. We won't get far.
I've been hit!
Take it
They're shooting at it. Big shot. Big shot from the blue.
Yep. Fuck.
Trying to push up.
Taking
Yeah,
effective
from the blue building. I got armor box over here. Do you guys need armor plates?
Yeah.
Alright, come on, let's move right. We gotta move right. Oh my god. I'm sorry. Sorry, I don't know what I'm doing. I'm going. I thought you put the armor box down. That's the thing. I'm like, what? Putting it down right here.
Be advised, there's an enemy team hunting you.
I'll be shot!
Oh my god.
Running back.
Ah. Oh my god.
I'll be shot!
Closing, get to the new safe zone.
That was so annoying. It literally took all my armor to get over here. Wow. Oh, they're trying to come up.
Listen up, soldier. Win here and you return to the front line. But if you lose, you're done. Time to earn your freedom, soldier.
Watch.
What?
Sending you back to base.
Like,
Pete?
It's not over yet. Your
What?
team can still buy
Get
your
him
release.
back. Please change your plan. Please?
yeah, I need to let my controller charge after this.
Oh, okay. He said it was. Wait, real quick. Hold on.
Windows closing. Get to safety.
Don't see him. See him? They probably ran up to that house over there.
Mark out. Moving.
Yeah, it looks like they're fighting with someone.
Hold. Cancel them.
Oh, we gotta go. We gotta buy him back. We don't have to buy him back. Let's just fight this out, man. We don't know if the circle's gonna end up in the hills, and we just want this. I'm this close to a buy station. I'm buying. My boy's at. Go for it. Go for it.
That's the only way you're gonna win.
Yep, there he is. There's the sniper. Where? Whoever called that. This is for you. This is for you. I'm staying down here for right now.
Stop the enemy trackers.
It's not gonna be down there. What if it's gonna be? I don't know yet. Can't tell you. I don't know what I'm doing yet. There's a king on my left.
Gas is moving in. New safe zone located.
Oh, that is this. They're on me. They're on me. They're on me.
Hold on.
I'm not.
Here.
Closing position.
Oh, nice. Hey, I got your cover if you can fall back.
You guys got any spare armor plates?
No.
Or can you guys...
One's dropping in right here.
Moving. Never mind. Never mind.
Oh, they're behind us.
Yeah.
Huh. Imagine that.
Hey, come on, let's go. Fuck. They're on top of this hill right here.
Repositioning.
Losing ground.
Get inside the safe zone. Now.
You got any spare armor?
No, bro, I just dropped. They're right above me, though.
They're on me.
Rounds incoming.
Gas is inbound. Marking new safe zone.
Moving.
Don't keep shooting at me. We're on the top of the hill. He knows we're gonna have to dip.
Oh!
Oh, wow. Proximity mine. That ain't good. Where was...
You're almost
he was
there.
in the corner? Oh, wow! Look at that guy!
Y'all go ahead and run a few. I got a damn charge my damn controller. I can't be playing with this.
Got killed with a shotgun. Oh my goodness. Straight up trash.
Yeah, give it like 20 minutes though.
Alright.
Well, Nietzsche believed that Christianity, as it stood at the end of the 1800s, was an untenable philosophy because he thought it had abandoned its moral obligations by escaping into some beyond, and therefore damned life as it was actually lived by human beings. So he felt that the demise was a good thing. He points out one other thing, and this is the difference between having a theory and then learning to theorize. He says, look, if you've been raised in a tradition, whatever that tradition happens to be, you have a belief system, whatever that belief system happens to be, and it falls apart on you at any one point, you suffer for two reasons. The first is your belief system fell apart. And that's not a good thing. It leaves everything unfixed and open, and you drown in possibility in a sense. That's a Kierkegaardian phrase. But the second consequence is even worse. Once you've learned that one belief system is solid to be demolished and fall apart, then it's very difficult ever again to have any faith in any belief systems whatsoever. So not only do you become a doubter of your own creed, let's say, you become a meta-doubter, which is the doubter of all belief systems. Well, in the step from that to nihilism, maybe those are exactly the same thing. You know, and that's really, you can think about that in some sense as the disease of the critical rational mind. It can saw off any branch that it's sitting on. And, you know, the utility of that is leave no stone unturned, right? You're supposed to question things, and the utility of that is you learn new things. But the pricing for it is that you're not necessarily ever certain about anything. And, you know, you could say, well, maybe you shouldn't be certain about anything, but you forget that. You know, you're going to have to act as if you're certain many times in your life. For when you choose a permanent mate, for example, if you do that, which you probably will, because you're university educated, and university educated people still do that, although no one else does. So, and you're going to pick a career, and you're going to make decisions one after the other, about which, if you're not certain, you can't make. In which case, you have no life. You're just a whirlwind of chaos. So you're stuck with the necessity of following a course of action, which is acted out certainty, that your intellect cannot regard as appropriate. And that's hard on people. Why should I choose this instead of this? Why should I act this way instead of that way? You know, I don't know is not a very useful answer when you're a creature that's as cognitively able as we are. This is something absolutely brilliant. It's very difficult for me to believe that it was written so long ago. So, this is Dostoevsky's criticism of communism. 40 years before communism was a political force. So Dostoevsky's thinking really hard about this nihilism problem. By the way, Nietzsche read Dostoevsky quite extensively. He's thinking about it. He thinks, well, there seems to be two alternatives. One is this superhuman nihilism, which is sort of a variant of what Nietzsche proposed, because Nietzsche proposed that it would become the responsibility of every human being after the death of their religious tradition to establish their own values. Now you think that's a... He didn't think people could do it. He thought there'd have to be a new kind of person who could manage it, because, you know, he's basically asking you to generate coherent and pragmatically applicable philosophical structure out of nothing during your lifetime. It's like, well, good luck with that. You know, plus he also assumed that people create values, or that they could create values. And, you know, that's true to some degree, and we'll talk about this more when we get into the phenomenological end of things. But it's not self-evident, right? Because one of the things you may notice is that you can't force yourself to love someone, right? You can't just decide that you're going to value someone and then poof, that happens. In fact, you may want with all your heart, or at least with all your mind, to value someone because they deserve it. They've never mistreated you. Maybe you said you'd be loyal to them, and poof, someone comes along, you're tremendously attracted to them, and off you go like someone who's possessed. Well, did you create that value? It's like, well, I mean, closer to your own experience. Like, can you actually make yourself interested in something you're bored about? It's like, good luck trying that. You know, you'd rather clean up underneath your bed than read a paper you don't want to read. You know, and you can't just tell yourself, well, I need to read this paper for the following reasons, and poof, it becomes interesting. It's like, no. Your value systems, whatever they happen to be, are off doing their own thing. And the reason for that, in large part, is because they're possessed by ideas that you don't know about, that have these historical roots, and that play you in some sense like they play puppets. And this stuff is no joke. Okay, so this is what Dostoevsky said way back in the late 1800s. This was in a book called Notes from Underground. And it's about a man who's like Hamlet in some sense. He's a modern man. He's a 20th century man, really. And his problem is, he's hyper-intelligent and he can't figure out what the hell he should do with his life. And it's really bothering him. And it's worse than that, because not only is it really bothering him that he can't get his act together and act with any degree of consistency and character, but he knows that he can't do that, and he tortures himself upon his weakness at the same time. So he's a very neurotic character, but he's a sophisticated and intelligent neurotic. And so he's run through all the arguments that you might conjure up to sort of talk yourself out of being neurotic and suffering. He has nothing but contempt for his own character. He thinks he's much weaker than people who can just act without thinking. And he's in this pit, this horrible pit, and it's a wonderful thing to read. It's quite blackly comical. And it's a great philosophical and psychological study. Anyways, in one of the sections of this book, Dostoevsky's protagonist starts to talk about alternatives to his nihilistic hopelessness. And he thinks about utopianism as a potential alternative. So what's utopianism? Well, in some sense, medieval Christianity promised people redemption after they died. Well, a utopian creed does the same thing, except it promises it here and now. So that's communism was a particular utopian creed. And fascism had the same element, although it was...
My name is Joe. I'm a sustainability science researcher at Amazon. Climate change is the fight of our generation. And the biggest obstacle right now is we're running out of time. Amazon now has a goal to be net zero carbon by 2040. We don't really know exactly how we're going to get there. It's going to be pretty hard. But one way or another, we're going to reduce our carbon footprint to net zero. I want my son to know that I tried my hardest to make things better for his generation.
Cats are curious creatures, which makes their owners curious creatures too. Why do cats love tiny spaces so much? How much do they sleep every day? And when does a kitten become a cat? You see, the more questions we ask about cats, the better we're able to answer their health needs. That's why at Royal Canin, we spend decades studying and questioning these magnificent pets. Because the best way to keep your cat healthy is to learn more about them.
It was, I don't know how to describe it. It was less intellectually sophisticated than communism. Communism basically said, look, if you guys just stop being selfish and share, we can transform the world into a place where everyone will have enough of everything and everyone will be able to do what they want to do. And because of the natural goodness of people, if selfishness can be overcome, that'll be the next best thing to a paradise. It's like it was a powerful idea for people, you know. The 80 years of our history was spent assessing and battling out the validity of that idea, and hundreds of millions of people died as a consequence of it. And you can understand why it was so attractive. I mean, still utopian ideologies are attractive to people. I mean, it's hard to read radical Islam as anything other than a utopian ideology. You know, the idea is once you establish rigid Sharia, then poof, you know, you've got the kingdom of God on earth. Well, and part of the reason that the radical Muslims are fighting against the West is because they see what they're doing as a counterposition to Western nihilism. And it's partly because they don't want to fall into that. You know, we would say, well, that's progress. It's like, yeah, it's progress by our standards. And it comes at a price. And also, we don't even understand how it was that we paid the price. So, the reason I'm telling you this is because you don't want to be thinking for any time at all that these sorts of issues have disappeared or that they're not relevant. They're relevant. Now, the guy who's advising Putin, his name is Alexander Dugin, And he's no admirer of Western liberalism. He thinks about it as fundamentally nihilistic. He thinks that its universal application would result in the dissolution of all local culture and the production of this sort of materialistic hyper-individuality. And he's an admirer of tradition, you know, and specifically Russian Orthodox tradition. And he believes that the cult cultures, India, Russia, and China in particular, should develop their own local cultures, keep the West the hell out, and act as a counterposition to nihilistic liberalism. Now, so, here's how to conceptualize yourself in Jungian terms. The part of you that you consider you, roughly speaking, Jung considered the ego. And you might think about that as the most individual part of your psychophysiological being. I mean, the difference between individual and collective in that sense is that you share very many attributes with other people, obviously. Your physical form is very much like that of other people, and then you share attributes with other living creatures way back down the phylogenetic chain. And so in that regard, there's nothing specifically individual about you. But the part of you that you identify with most completely and that you regard as unique, that's the Jungian ego. Now, Jung sort of conceptualized your psyche as a, I would say as a place, I suppose, that many spirits could inhabit. And you might think about a spirit from the Jungian perspective as a personality that can inhabit the psyche. And so, like all the psychoanalysts, Jung regarded the psyche as a relatively loose collection of partially integrated personalities. And each of those personalities had their own perspective, their own thoughts, their own way of looking at the world. That would be the perspective. Their own thoughts, their own emotions, their own habits, and their own actions. And those were roughly aggregated into some sort of unity. And that was the ego. Now, the ego has a public face. And the public face, Jung called the persona. Persona means mask. And the persona is both that part of you that you show to other people instead of the part that you hide. And then also, to some degree, it might be the form that your ego takes even to you. So, for example, if you're a naive person, you might think that your public face is all there is of you. The rough difference between the ego and the persona might be conceptualized this way, that, you know, there are things that you think that you won't say in public, maybe not even in private. Some of those things you're pretty aware of, and those would be thoughts that are relevant to the ego, but not the persona. And then some of them you don't even really want to be aware of, and Jung would consider those more associated with the shadow. Now, the shadow, the existence of the shadow, first of all, you might want to remember that the best way to conceptualize Jung's archetypal constructions is in some sense as metaphors. So you can say that, well, Jung thought that it was useful to separate up the psyche into persona and ego and then shadow. It isn't that there aren't other ways that it could be broken up, but breaking it up this way is useful for certain purposes, and Jung regarded this terminology as particularly useful from a psychoanalytic perspective and also from a historical perspective. So perhaps the divisions could be made otherwise, and there are many ways of looking at archetypes, but this is sufficiently useful to progress with. Now, people's personas are generally somewhat harmless and somewhat socialized. If you don't know how to act in public, you don't have a well-crafted persona. You know, some of you are going to be the kinds of relatively deep-thinking intellectuals who think that small talk is nonsense. And there's some utility in that thinking, because in some sense, from a philosophical sense, obviously it's nonsense. But if you don't know how to make small talk, basically what that means is that you have a poorly developed persona. And what that'll mean is that you're not going to do very well, at least at the beginning of social engagements, because you need to be able to convince people that you're basically civilized and social before it's even reasonable for them to go beyond pleasantries with you. And the ability to exchange pleasantries in a relatively banal way in a variety of different circumstances is part of having a persona. And you don't want to denigrate the utility of that, because you need it. You know, as you progress in your careers, for example, you're going to be thrust into situations where you don't really know anyone, and the purpose of the gathering is to familiarize a large number of people with one another. And there's a skill that's associated with that that's somewhat glib social ability. The Jungians would say, well, you shouldn't, if you don't have a persona, you're just a disaster. But by the same token, you shouldn't be only persona, because one of the possibilities is that the ego can identify with the persona, and then the person thinks that they are what they show the social world. And the problem with that, at least from the Jungian perspective, is that A, people are a lot more than the persona, they're a lot more than the ego. And B, a lot of the things that make them more than mere persona or more than mere ego are not necessarily things that are acceptable in casual public gatherings. So, for example, because of your psychophysiological makeup, you all have the capacity for aggression. Now, a lot of you, especially the ones that are more agreeable, you could say that even it's either that capacity for aggression has been underdeveloped because you've identified with a certain mode of social being, or you could say perhaps to the degree that agreeableness is temperamental, that the aggressive tendency isn't as powerful in you as it is in other people. That might lead you to make judgments like, and I'm sure some of you, perhaps some of you who had an angry parent, or particularly an angry father, have decided at some point in your life that to be aggressive is wrong. To be angry is wrong, for example, or to be aggressive is wrong. It's morally wrong. One of the things that happens in psychotherapy very frequently, though, is that people come into psychotherapy for a variety of reasons. Some of them are merely practical. They're having problems in adaptation because their lives have got very, very complicated and they really don't know what to do about it. Sometimes they go into psychotherapy because they have very high levels of negative emotion, and that can be associated with the first problem. But very often they come into therapy because they're getting pushed around constantly and they really don't have anything that's a sufficiently well-developed personal identity. And generally, that happens, by the way, more often with women than it does with men, and that's because women are, by temperament, more agreeable than men, and perhaps also by socialization. Temperament certainly plays a big role. Often then, the goal of therapy is assertiveness training. And assertiveness training you could think of as the behavioral psychologist's equivalent to incorporating the shadow. So, you know, you may think, well, it's a necessary part of existence to be nice to other people. And there's some truth in that. Not really. It's a very shallow way of looking at the world. Because nice is not a very sophisticated word. But even if that's the word that you do use, you should also be nice to yourself. And sometimes what that means is that you have to put forward your own wishes and desires in a manner that causes a certain amount of conflict. And in order to withstand that conflict, you have to be able to draw on the sources of aggression that in some sense are a deep part of your inbuilt set of possibilities. Now, the reason that's necessary, in part from biological perspective is that people are often afraid of engaging in conflict because they're afraid, because conflict can be real trouble. And anger inhibits fear. So if you don't have a well-developed capacity for, well, we could say rage, then you can't overcome your fear, and then you can't stand up for yourself, and then you're going to get run over. Now, the problem with that is that if you get run over enough, it'll make you resentful. And then that will make you aggressive, except it'll make you aggressive in sneaky, underground, and somewhat unconscious ways that are much less likely to be productive than, you know, a frank exchange of viewpoints and some conscious negotiation. So one of the things I do in therapy for people who need assertiveness training is I get them to pay attention to their resentment. And resentment is often a good avenue into the shadow, because first of all, resentment is a pretty destructive emotion. It's an extremely useful emotion, but it can be very destructive because it gives rise to, well, first of all, a sense of victimization, and second, then, the underground growth of all sorts of ideas of revenge and vengeance, and also a kind of stubborn non-cooperativeness, because who wants to cooperate when they feel taken advantage of? And so part of Jung's idea with regards to the shadow is that obviously the social world wants you to be peaceful and predictable, and maybe even easy to get along with. But that doesn't necessarily mean that peaceful, predictable, and easy to get along with, A, are the only virtues, because they're certainly not. And one thing we know about virtues is that if they're taken to too great an extreme, they become vices. And B, they're certainly not the only virtues. You know, there are what you might call darker virtues, so to speak. They're more dangerous virtues in some sense, because they harness forces that can be very destructive if they're not utilized consciously. And aggression is certainly an example of that. So here's some fundamental rules about the shadow that you might think about as you move forward through your life. So a lot of times you're going to have to negotiate on your own behalf. And so what that means from the perspective of agreeableness and aggression is that you should be able to stand up for yourself at least as well as you would stand up for someone that you care for. So the problem with the idea of being nice to other people is that it doesn't take you into account, and that's supposed to be an equation, even though it's, as I said, nice is a pretty weak philosophical term. But the fundamental rule is that you should certainly include yourself in the circle of people who deserve respect and care, and that means that you have to be willing to advocate for yourself. And if you're willing to advocate for yourself and you want to do it, you have to be able to say no. You have to, because otherwise you have to say yes, and then you can't negotiate. And in order to say no, you have to have armed yourself with strategies and plans that enable you to say no. You can't be dependent. You can't be afraid of potentially searching out new opportunities, etc. You have to be willing to stand your ground. And it's very difficult to do that without drawing on some of the deeper sources of psychological energy that are part of our psychophysiological heritage. So Jung would say, well, there's the persona and the ego, and you can identify with your persona, and then you're kind of a shallow puppet of culture. So Pinocchio as the marionette is a persona. Pinocchio himself is an ego, but as a marionette, he's the persona. So anybody who's ideologically possessed, by the way, is a persona, although they're also possessed by the shadow, even though they don't know it. And you can tell when someone's ideologically possessed, because you can predict whatever they're going to say once you know a few axioms of their particular ideology. So a given ideology probably has 4 or 5 explanatory axioms, like everything is caused by economic disparity, that might be one, or success is due to hard work, that might be another. And those are broad enough statements, even though they're in opposition to one another. Both of those statements are broad enough so you can virtually explain everything with them. The problem with it is that you can predict what the explanation is going to be before you even have to talk to the person. And whenever you're talking to someone and you can predict exactly what they're going to say because they're using some ideologically mediated structure, then you know perfectly well that they've identified with the persona. You also know that they're likely to be possessed by a pretty vicious shadow, because we know that the shadow of ideological possession is repression and death. So one of the things that's always interesting about the psychoanalysts is that whenever they see something good, they're always looking for the dark side of it, and vice versa, by the way. Whenever they see anything dark, they're looking for the good side of it. And so they're very unlikely to take anything at face value. And so if someone comes up to you and says, I stand for some good thing, the thing that you ask, if you're psychoanalytically minded, is, well, what does that mean that you hate? Because there's a reasonable probability that even though you think that you're standing for something, then a lot of what's motivating you is the desire to be against something. And that's particularly the case when you're dealing with negative emotions, because they're more powerful than positive emotions. So it's one of the things, George Orwell, who was one of the 20th century's great anti-ideologues, published a book in the 1940s, 30s, 40s, called Road to Wigan Pier, where he went to stay with some coal miners in the north of England. And those coal miners, man, they had a hard life. Like, some of them had to crawl 3/4 of a mile to work in tunnels in the morning, in tunnels where they couldn't stand up, just to get to work. So, and then they do their like 10-hour shift in the coal mine, digging out coal, and then they'd have to crawl back 3/4 of a mile underground, you know. So they had very, very hard lives. And so, you know, Orwell was pretty unimpressed by the conditions in which they were forced to work. So he wrote an essay for the English Left Book Club, and that was a socialist publishing house, but he appended another essay to it where he criticized the socialists who were most likely to read that sort of book as much more oriented towards hating the rich than loving the poor. It was devastating criticism, and the Left Book Club didn't even want to publish his book, but they ended up publishing it. It's become a very famous essay, but it lays out a general principle. It's like, if you have identified with a given persona, which is like a social machine in a sense, and you think you're all good because of what you think, then you might ask, well, where do all the parts of you that aren't good go? Because unless you think that you're a saint and that everyone who thinks differently than you is Satan himself, then you're missing a chunk of yourself. You're not taking a chunk of yourself into account, and that's the part that is nowhere near as well behaved or as benevolent as you might think, or that you actually have any reason to believe. You know, and so one of the things that has struck me as a consequence of analyzing 20th century history, and often through a Jungian lens, is that there's not much evidence that the sorts of atrocities that characterized the Soviet Union and Nazi Germany were the result of a few extremely corrupt people at the top of the hierarchy forcing everyone down into slavery and then making them do terrible things. I think that's a very weak explanation. In fact, I think it's wrong. I think the historical record is quite clear that it's wrong. I mean, in East Germany, for example, 1/3 of the people were government informers. So that means if you had a family of 6, 2 of your family members were reporting on you to the government. So when you look at human capacity for destructiveness, if you don't regard yourself as one of the agents of that destructiveness, or at least one of the potential agents of that destructiveness, then from the Jungian perspective at least, there's a high probability that you're part of the problem rather than part of the solution. Now, that doesn't necessarily mean that you should be blamed for it, because blame has to come from another person, and it isn't obviously clear that, like, I get to blame you for being potentially violent. That, I think, is a complete mistake. But if you familiarize yourself with the realm of human capability, and then you regard yourself as human, what that means is that you have to regard yourself as a creature that's capable of what human beings are capable of. And human beings are capable of a lot of things, and some of them are absolutely wonderful. I mean, there's nothing more remarkable than a human being on the planet. I mean, people can do amazing things, but the downside of that is that we can do absolutely horrible things, and it's not obvious that it's only the pathological people who do that. In fact, it's not reasonable to assume. So the shadow for Jung was a very big deal, you know, and he believed in some sense, and this is where the ideas get archetypal, he believed that the ideas of the evil twin of the king, or the evil twin of God for that matter, so that would be Satan in Christian theology, that was as real a representation of the human and transpersonal human capacity for evil as there was. And he believed that if you look deep enough into your own foul motivations, and if you looked far enough down, that you'd be looking, so to speak, into hell itself, and you'd find the main controller of hell deep inside your psyche. So it was no journey for the timid. And Jung also believed that, and this is what separates him from a New Age thinker, because he's often accused of being a New Age thinker. New Age thinkers tell you things like follow your bliss and you'll run into utopia, you'll encounter utopia. But that isn't what the Jungians, especially Jung, said about his process of individuation at all. He said that if you follow what's meaningful and you do it honestly, it will take you somewhere you really do not want to go. And until you go there, you'll never be able to climb up higher on the other side. And so that provides a real impediment for enlightenment, because for enlightenment there's a price to be paid. And if you look at archetypal representations of the cost of enlightenment, you often find that the person who becomes enlightened is damaged in some profound way before it happens. So for example, in the ancient Egyptian stories of Horus and Osiris, Horus loses an eye when he has to encounter Set. He's the ancient Egyptian equivalent of Satan. So it's no joke. It's seriously no joke. You know, and it's, you know, one of Jung's propositions essentially was that the human race will continue to be plagued by phenomena like the outbreak of the genocidal Nazi and Soviet ideologies until people realize that the Nazis and the Soviets are them. That it isn't someone else's problem. It isn't other people who aren't you. It's you. If you were there, it would have been you. And you might say, well, no, I would have been a hero. It's like, no, probably not. Because they were rare. And I mean, unless you have real reason to think that you could have done it, then it's safer to think that you couldn't have and wouldn't have. And so then there's a responsibility that goes along with that. And the responsibility is to broaden your capacity of who you are so that you have the possibility of controlling the parts of your psyche that are very dark. Now, let me give you some examples of this. So, you know, there's a philosopher named Rousseau, and most of you are Rousseauians without knowing it. And Rousseau basically made the following propositions. He said that human beings were basically good, but they were corrupted by culture. So the essential human nature was good, and the corrupting influence was society. Now, that's true, but it's only half true. There's a philosopher named Hobbes who said exactly the opposite thing. He said, no, human beings are base and violent and uncontrollable, and unless we have society structuring their interactions, he was more like Freud, structuring their interactions, they would be constantly at one another's throat. And then if you think, well, who's right, Rousseau or Hobbes? First of all, they're both right, even though they say the opposite thing. And second, well, you look around the world and you tell me whether there are more Hobbesian states or Rousseauian states. And the answer to that's pretty clear. Most countries are disastrous authoritarian dictatorships where people live and suffer. And the places where civilization has become stable enough so that people can live peaceful, relatively peaceful and productive lives are very rare. They're more common than they were in the past. And they seem to be getting more common all the time, thank God. But it's a lot easier to be disorganized and brutal than it is to be organized, productive, and free. So, now, Jung believed that the shadow is something that kind of comes apart when you face it. So it's a blurry black mass in a sense before you start to differentiate it. And so you can tell what the shadow is as far as any one of you is concerned, because you can start to notice how you aren't like you act, especially when you act around people that you're trying to impress, or people whose opinions you think are important to you. You have to pay attention to it, though, and you'll be able to see that there's a distinction between what you say, because you're saying something in order to make something turn out the way you want it to turn out, and what you actually think. And the shadow's at work in two ways there. One way is that it's convincing you that using your speech and actions to manipulate the world in a conscious manner is a good idea, and it's not. And the second is that you'll see that there are counter thoughts to what you think. So if you, for example, if you find yourself in the position of being too nice to someone, maybe it's a boss, for example, who's a bit of a tyrant, and you don't feel that you're in a position to say anything in your own defense against his or her bullying tactics. The consequence of that is that you'll think all sorts of dark and dangerous thoughts about that person in your own fantasies when you're not interacting with them. And if you catch a hold of those fantasies and you let them play themselves out consciously, you'll see that they take you to very dark places. Now, or at least to places that you regard as very dark. So, Jung's notion essentially is that when you start to uncover those elements of yourself that don't fit comfortably within your ideas about yourself, is that you discover things about yourself that are also potentially very useful. It's as if you threw the baby out with the bathwater when you were setting up your personality. So, for example, earlier I talked about people who may have decided very early in their life that they're just not going to get angry. It's like, well, it's not necessarily something that you want to throw away. It might instead be something that you want to bring within the realm of your personality so that it can express itself consciously and in an articulated manner. Because without anger, for example, you don't have any power, which basically means that no one needs to be afraid of you. And you might think, well, people shouldn't be afraid of you. And then a Jungian might ask, well, what in the world would ever lead you to believe that? I mean, the distinction between being respected and being feared is not clear. But I would say that you don't respect anyone whom you couldn't imagine fearing if they decided to make that their priority. So, without the capacity for aggression, you're not going to get any respect. That doesn't mean that people have to fear you, but it does mean that you have to incorporate your capacity for aggression enough so that they would fear you if you wanted them to. And if you think about it, that makes a lot more sense from a moral perspective than the argument that you should be nice to everyone. Because if you're nice to everyone because you don't have any choice, because you're weak and ineffectual and harmless, then that's not a virtue. That's just, you just can't do anything else. You're harmless by default. And harmless and virtuous are by no means the same thing. If, by contrast, you're capable of causing all sorts of terrible trouble, and you know it, and you know how, and then you decide not to do it because you can carefully articulate a different route, well, then you have the possibility of virtue. Because without the capacity to sin, so to speak, there's no virtue in not doing it. So, if you're a young man who feels that sleeping around is wrong, but never has the opportunity to do it, then you can hardly attribute that to your virtue. So a good Jungian would say, well, you're just making a virtue out of a vice. It's just rationalization. It has nothing to do with virtue. Now, if you are attracted to people and you decide that attraction should only manifest itself within certain tight boundaries, and that's a voluntary choice, that's a whole different issue. Now, when Jung claims, for example, that you throw the baby out with the bathwater when you're trying to develop and become a socially acceptable personality, that happens in a different way as far as he's concerned for each of the genders. And so one of the prices Jung would say that we pay, and that this is a very modern idea in some ways, for growing up as a distinctly gendered society, is that it's very easy for men to suppress and fail to develop those elements of their character that might be considered classically feminine. And it's difficult for women to develop and express those aspects of their personality that might be classically considered masculine. But so Jung believed that nested inside the shadow, in some sense, were the contrasexual capacities. So, for example, for a man, given what we know about the temperamental difference between men and women, it may be that men could develop the capacity for true compassion and care if they could find that ability within what they've thrown out in the shadow. And women, for example, could find the capacity to be aggressive and assertive because that's part of what they threw out during their stage of their course of development because of its a priori categorization as inappropriate behavior. Now, that doesn't mean that Jung thought that people should be raised without any gender identity. That issue never came up for him. He just thought that once you had established a personality that was sufficiently developed to be acceptable socially and functional on the individual level, then you could have the opportunity to expand that personality and to take into yourself elements of perception and thought and behavior that you wouldn't have had the sophistication to be able to handle at an earlier stage of development. So Jung would say, perhaps, that if you're a male, you have to become masculine before you could become feminine. And if you were a female, the reverse is true. But that if your development only stops with a narrow and categorical gender identity, then there are elements of being that you could draw on that aren't at your disposal, and that will make you weak. So the shadow breaks up into the anima and the animus, and the anima is the female inside the male, so to speak, and the animus is the male inside the female. And Jung believed that he could see those partial spirits manifesting themselves in people's behavior. And so he talked about a couple of typical behaviors that he thought were associated either with anima possession, so that would be in the case of a man, or animus possession in the case of a woman. And so he would regard, if you ever talk to someone who's female, who seems to respond to all of your propositions with nothing but argumentation for the sake of argumentation, you would regard that as a manifestation of possession by the animus. And if you ever talk to a man who is irrationally possessed by second-rate and futile emotions, then he would regard that as possession by the animal. So, and you can see that if you watch for it, and if you believe in such things. The best thing to do when confronted with someone whose animus possessed is just shut up, because you're not going to make any headway, because the point of the argument, of an animus-inspired argument, is to get you to argue, not to win. Because by getting you to argue, the animus wins. So, And then behind those two things, behind the shadow and the anima and the animus, there's a final archetype, which is the archetype of the self. And that's, Jung believed that the self was what you were as a totality. And that's a hard thing to understand, but you could think about it this way. You could think about the self as the total of what you are now, plus the total of all those things that you could still be. So it would be you as a reality, plus you as potential. And that's a strange idea, right? Because we don't really know how to understand the idea of potential as modern empirical people, because potential, virtually by definition, is not yet manifest, and also not a straightforward thing to either measure or conceptualize. By the same token, everybody acts as if they have potential, unrealized potential. And so Jung generated up a category to account for that, which he felt was expressed in all sorts of symbolic ways. So, for example, the wise old man, like the wizards in the movies that all of you have seen in the last 5 years, it's always the same wizard. Sometimes it's even the same actor. It's like that's an archetype of the wise old man. And for Jung, Christ was an archetype of the self as well. And I told you why that was to some degree, and it's partly because the phoenix is also an archetype of the self, because the phoenix is something that can die and be reborn. And so the phoenix stands for the part of your personality that can let one thing go, one part of you, which is an alive part, can let that go and burn up, so to speak, so that something new can be born. Because you very seldom gain something before you let something else go. That's partly because what you already assume can be the worst impediment that you have to learning something new. And it's complicated because sometimes what you know worked in the past. You know, so you can think about that. Maybe you're a perfectly well-adapted 11-year-old and you're still acting that way when you're 15. It's like, well, it's hard to let that go because it worked and you put a lot of effort into it. But unless you let it go, the new personality isn't going to be able to manifest itself. So you have to stop being a child before you can be an adult. And there's a sacrifice that goes along with that. It's also a sacrifice that parents have to make, right? Because in order for a parent to encourage you to adopt the responsibilities of an individual, they have to allow you as a child to die. And Freud's observation on that phenomena was that many parents, and he believed this was particularly characteristic of mothers because of their tight bond with their children and the dependency that implies, that it was particularly difficult for a mother to let her child die so that an adult could manifest itself in that child's place. And that's fundamentally, in many ways, the Oedipal complex. Okay, so now I'm going to show you some of these things again, because the thing about Jung is that it's not easy to understand what he has to say, and it's not a simple thing to explain it. And his books are complicated, although I don't think they're any more complicated than they have to be. Like, I don't think Jung is obscure. I think he's just difficult. And then beyond difficult, he's actually frightening. So there's lots of reasons that people don't like Jung. And the fact that he's difficult and frightening are probably the two foremost objections. I think the other thing that happened to Jung that maybe slowed his acceptance as an intellectual was that many of his students were women, like his primary students. And the people who developed his ideas, many of the people who continued to develop his ideas after he died were women, and that was perhaps not the most effective way of making headway in the academic world at the time that he was alive. So let's look at some things. I'm going to show you some things from The Lion King, because The Lion King shows you archetypes everywhere. So let's do this first. Okay, so the first thing that I would like to point out here is that this takes place at daybreak. And daybreak is when the sun reemerges. And from an archetypal perspective, the sun reemerges from a terrible battle that it had with the thing that devours the sun at night. And it comes up again triumphant in the morning. And so it's the dawn of consciousness, and that idea that the sun undergoes this battle is associated with the idea that you descend into unconsciousness when you sleep, and magically you reemerge from it in the morning. And you do that in accordance with the sun. So for you, darkness is a time of unconsciousness, and there's a tight relationship between unconsciousness and darkness. And so Jung would say, people projected that idea. It was an idea that was in their imagination, that unconsciousness and darkness were tightly aligned. And so they used their imagination to explain the world and conceptualize the sun in those terms of imagination. So that if you analyze the terms of imagination, you can get some understanding into the structure of the imagination. And so that's one of them. Consciousness and light are the same thing. Illumination, enlightenment, all of those things. And that's because we're primarily visual creatures, and we're conscious during the day. And so this is a new beginning, the new day, which is something that everyone also experiences, because sleep washes away the cares of the previous day. And it does revitalize you. We know perfectly well that if you deprive people of sleep for any length of time, it's not good for them. It derails them entirely, deranges them entirely. So there is a reason that this movie opens with the dawn of the day. Okay, so there's another recasting of the same idea, right? Except the lyrics also indicated that there was an association between the dawn of self-consciousness and the emergence of the light, because the lyrics were the day we stepped onto the planet and stepped out blinking into the light. There's a transition from unconsciousness to consciousness metaphor underlying that. And so one of the statements the film is making, or one of the ways that the film is trying to set you up to understand this as a story about the emergence of consciousness into the light. Now you might say, well, did the filmmakers know all this? The answer to that is, A, it depends on what you mean by know, which is really a critical factor in this sort of discussion, and B, well, yes. And the way they manifested the fact that they knew it is because they knew when things fit together. So, you know, when you're writing a story or something like that, or reading a story, you know when the story's going well. You think, yeah, that makes sense. In fact, you don't even notice it, right? You just assume that everything's fine because it makes sense. It doesn't jar you out of the narrative. And so people are perfectly capable, especially if they concentrated on it for long periods of time, of assembling a narrative with images that make sense. Now, they may not know why it makes sense. In fact, if they're actually artists, they don't know why it makes sense, because they're expanding their capacity to comprehend and explain things while they're producing what they're producing. They have to be moving beyond what they know, because otherwise they're just producing propaganda. You know, and there are elements of many Disney films that sink now and then into propaganda, sort of conscious moralizing, but when the films are really working, they're not doing that at all. And when they are consciously moralizing, they're boring very quickly, plus they date extremely rapidly.
There's more to see than can ever be seen. More to do than can ever be done. There's far too much to take in here. Not to find than can ever be found. The sun rolling high, the sapphire sky keeps raising the star.
Okay, so that's a brilliant piece of film editing there, because the filmmakers sweep your eye along and then make something appear as a revelation. and they do it at exactly the same time that the music swells to a climax, and that's indicating to you that something of tremendous importance is about to be revealed. And so you see two things here. The first thing you see is what's called Pride Rock, which is a roughly pyramidal shape, at least a triangular shape, that emerges in the middle of the landscape, that actually serves symbolically as the center of the kingdom. You can think about that as an Egyptian pyramid, or you could think about it as a dominance hierarchy. It doesn't really matter. It's both of those things. It's also the thing on which the thing that the animals are subjugated to stands, right? Because that's where the king is, and the king happens to be a lion, and the lion is a solar beast. It's always been a solar beast. It's associated with the sun. And it's the king of beasts because it's an apex predator. It's at the top of the hierarchy. And for whatever reason, although obviously the lions in the animated movie, they're not actually lions. It's important to remember that while you're analyzing the film, because it's very easy to just think of them as lions, even though clearly they're not. Now you also see this little character up in the right-hand corner, left-hand corner, and that's Zazu, right? And Zazu is the eye of the king. And so the king is on top of the pyramid, but the king's eye is free from the king, and it can go all over the place, even where the pyramid can't see. And that's the eye on the top of the pyramid. You've seen that symbol everywhere, no doubt. It's the symbol that's on the back of the American dollar bill. And there's a reason for it. It's because the eye of the king is not part of the hierarchy. The eye of the king is something that's always free of the hierarchy and can fly over all hierarchies. And that's equivalent to the thing that could make its way up any hierarchy in some sense. It's also the same as Horus, the god of vision in the ancient Egyptian stories. Okay, so there we've got the king, and we'll see that he's on top of the rock, which is where the king belongs. He's also in full sunlight, even though that's not characteristic of any of the other animals. He's got his little bird there that tells him things, because the king is someone who pays attention. Because the king who doesn't pay attention is a tyrant. And then the wind is blowing through the king's hair because the wind is spirit. And so the king is also something that's associated with the everlasting spirit. Pneuma. Pneuma is the breath of air, and it's also the essence of life from an archetypal perspective. So to be inspired is like respiring. To be inspired is to take in spirit. And the kind of spirit that the king takes in is associated with the image of the wind. Now, you got to look at his face. Remember, before I was saying, because the animators do a very good job of this, they gave him a very mature face. And a mature face is something out of which something is coming, instead of something into which something is coming. And you'll see that the king, Mufasa, is always looking like this. He's very intent and focused and intimidating. Whereas his son, right up until he becomes initiated, is like this, always. As soon as he becomes initiated, and I'll show you that in the film, his face hardens. And it isn't until his face hardens that he can go back and fight Scar, who's basically a figure of the shadow. Now, originally, this character, Rafiki, was going to be one of those typical sort of Disney sidekick buffoons. That didn't work out so well in the narrative, and he ended up as a symbol of the self instead. And Rafiki is obviously a shaman, and he's the part of the psyche that guides its transformation. So here's another way of looking at the self. It's a very interesting idea. So, you know, as you go through life, there's going to be triumphs and then catastrophes. And when there's a catastrophe, the psyche falls apart, and then maybe it gathers its resources back together and pulls itself together. It's going like this. Well, Jung would say the self is what's guiding that process. So the ego feels it like this. So that's triumph and catastrophe, or tragedy and comedy. But the self is the thing that's underneath all of it, allowing those transformations to take place. And that's Rafiki, and that's why he's associated as well with the sun. So, and he's a good king because he's in touch with the self. So that makes him not something that's either serving his persona or his ego. But you could say that what he's serving is a manner of ruling that allows for the appropriate amount of stability and transformation to take place in the kingdom so that it remains stable but also adapting to change. And the king is guided in that by the little bird who tells him what's going on in those places he can't see. Now that's clearly a Madonna and child image. And the reason for that is quite simple. I mean, you might think, well, why would the idea of the Madonna and child, which by the way is a far older idea than the Christian representation of it. There's lots of figures of Madonnas and Madonnas and children, yeah. In ancient Egyptian art, for example, and that'd be Isis with Horus. Well, the reason that that's an archetype is because any society who doesn't regard the dyad of mother and infant as something sacred, which would mean of highest value, is doomed, obviously. Because without that being held as a value, the society will cease to propagate, and that will be the end of it. So if the society isn't structured so that that dyad is up among the highest of values, then the society has become ungovernably corrupt. So you see that Rafiki there just anointed the little king with something that was orange and that was something like the sun. So the idea that the film is expressing is that there's some sun-like substance that's being associated with this newborn son of the king, and that's a dramatic manifestation of his destiny, and an indication that he has to also be encultured, because what Rafiki is doing is a cultural act before he's going to be complete. Now the sand is also an indication that he's mortal. Now, watch what happens here, because the filmmakers, I think they just nail this part. So they're going to do the sweeping thing again, and the music rises to the ultimate climax of the song. And what's happening here is that the self is presenting the son. And so it's a presentation of the savior, fundamentally. And that's the thing that has just been born, that's the hero. And when the hero is presented and the sun breaks open wide and shines on him, Jung would call that a synchronous event. And what happens is there's an emotion associated with that, which you will feel. And it's at that time that all the animals bow down, and they do that spontaneously. And the idea is that there's a hierarchy here, and the little boy in the sun is the highest element of the hierarchy. And when that manifests itself, and you can see beyond the facade to something that's divine behind it, the consequence of that will be a spontaneous bursting forth of awe. And I really think the filmmakers nailed that here. Yeah, so they hit that pretty hard there. So there's also a nuclear family thing going on in the background that you might have noticed, because of course the little king has a mother and a father. And that's partly because that works better, but also partly because the the archetypal hero is the son of culture and nature. So, okay, so here's a shadow figure. Here, he's represented here not so much as Simba's shadow, although he's part of Simba's shadow. He's represented as Mufasa's shadow. And so it's quite a complex idea, because what it says is when a king-like organization grows up, which means any organization, anything that's a hierarchy and that's powerful, there's a shadow element to it that tends towards totalitarianism and tyranny. And that's represented often by the king's evil brother. It's a very common motif in mythologically based stories. And the king is generally blind to his brother. So, often willfully blind, although that doesn't really seem to be the case in The Lion King. It is clearly the case that Mufasa underestimates the danger posed by his usually older and smarter brother. And the myths very often make the case that the evil king is the older one and also the one that's more intelligent. And the reason for that is that, as far as I can tell, is that intelligence is something that can go very wrong if it goes wrong. And one of its big temptations is that it produces models of the world and then falls in love with the models. And when it falls in love with the models, that makes it totalitarian, because it believes that its constructions are good enough so that there doesn't need to be anything else. So it eliminates the necessity of the transcendent. And that's definitely a characteristic of any totalitarian system. It says, this is everything we need. And then, you know, if you happen to suffer, or if you happen to openly rebel against the system, then you're regarded as an enemy of truth. And then it's fine to do with you whatever might be done, because everything worth doing is already being done. Now, he's got an interesting facial expression, and it's really worth watching facial expressions in animated cartoons, because they're not faces, right? What they are is the consequence of the observations of extremely talented artists about how people's faces configure themselves over very long periods of time, because these people are high-level artists. They know what they're doing. And so they're able to distill down certain facial expressions to describe a character. Now, this guy's obviously, he's whiny. He's got this supercilious and arrogant voice, so he's arrogant beyond belief. And he is also hard done by and resentful, and that's a really good, and maybe he has a reason. He's got a scar. Something happened to him that wasn't good, but he's taken on this attitude as resentful victim who really deserves to rule, if only everyone could see how wonderful he was. And then he has all sorts of reasons why the fact that he isn't powerful has nothing to do with his own shortcomings.
I'm never the king. I'll never see the light of another day. And you.
Did your mother ever tell you not to play with your food?
What do you want?
I'm here to announce that King Mufasa's on his way. So we better have a good excuse for missing the ceremony this morning.
Now, Sasha, you made me lose my lamb.
You lose more than that when the king gets through with you. He's as mad as a hippo with a head.
I quiver with fear.
Now, Scar, don't look at me that way.
Scar.
Impeccable timing, Your Majesty.
Well, as we can tell, the eyes of the king and Scar are not friends. And that's because Scar doesn't really want to see what's going on. Now, here's an interesting little archetype.
The sun will set and will rise.
This whole island. What about that shadow?
That's the eyes. There's never go this.
I thought King wanted to Office of the King getting away with it.
Okay, so that's quite interesting. There's a variety of statements there that are very, very cool. So one of them is, the kingdom is a bounded place. And so that's playing off the idea of explored territory versus unexplored territory, or the known versus the unknown. And the proposition there is that whatever the dominance hierarchy happens to be, it has a limited domain of competence. And the domain of competence is defined by everything that the light touches. Now, this is actually something that you can notice in your own life. It's quite interesting. You'll see that if you move into a new place or a new neighborhood, or if you do anything new at all, that nothing that you haven't attended to is actually yours. It will stay foreign in a sense and unfamiliar to you until you interact with it with a substantial amount of attention. And that's partly because while you're attending to it, which is an act of conscious will, you're modifying your perceptions and your thoughts and your actions and your emotions to take it into account as a phenomenon. And that means that you're competent there. And it takes conscious effort to be competent because you have to practice being competent at a new domain. And until you've practiced being competent in a new domain, it's not yours. And so this clip is showing what's basically an eternal truth, which is that your territory is whatever you've mastered. And it's demarcated by everything you haven't mastered. And in this particular representation, that's associated with death. It's also associated in some bizarre sense with paradise, because of course Simba encounters the elephant's grave out in no man's land, so to speak, but when he runs away across the desert, he also finds paradise. And so there's a paradoxical idea there that the unknown contains death and everything you need to make your life worthwhile. Here comes the anima. That's okay. So you see that cocky. He's a cocky little rat here. Okay, so he's very confident, but that's egotism and also persona. Well, it's no wonder he's confident. He's the son of the king, you know. And the fact is that he has a position of dominance that he doesn't deserve merely because he was born into it, and that's made him shallow and arrogant and possessed by a persona. Now, this little figure who is basically an anima figure always knocks him down a peg, continually knocks him down a peg. How many of you have seen Groundhog Day? Yeah. You remember in Groundhog Day, Bill Murray's character is he's a jackass at the beginning. He's very arrogant and he's very unskilled. And then he gets stuck in the same day, which is pretty funny because that is what happens to you if you're arrogant and unskilled. You end up in the same damn day. That's not fun. And then in that day, he becomes attracted to this woman who's an anima figure. And for years, as far as the film's concerned, every time he approaches her in his arrogant and clumsy way, she slaps him. So there's one scene in the movie where I think it lasts for about 30 seconds, and it's nothing but clips of her slapping him probably 30 times. At that point, you've seen him go through the same day in the continually painful way that he does, and she slaps him in those longer clips. And after a while, the filmmaker gets tired of that and just shows you nothing but the slaps. You know, eventually, he's brought so far down as a consequence of being stuck in the same day and continually being slapped that he falls completely apart, right? Then he tries to kill himself. One of the very comical things about that movie is that that doesn't work either. He just wakes up in the same day again. And you know, what that means in some sense is that if you're too damn stubborn to change, you will keep running into the same thing over and over, continually. And that's why you're in the same day, because you won't let go of it. And that might drive you even to question the value of your own being, but that's also not a very useful adaptive strategy. You know, and it isn't until he starts to take his rejection seriously that he starts to actually build some real character, right? And then he starts paying attention to the day. and finds out that there's all sorts of things that he can do during that day to make it rich and meaningful. And as soon as he does that enough and becomes an expert at it, poof, he gets out of the day, the same horrible day. And so that horrible day is also a representation of the tyranny of the state, because the state is something that's static. So anyways, Nella, she's...
With me? Yeah. Ha! Ginger, let me up.
Yeah, and while they're not paying attention, they end up in the shadows outside the kingdom. So here's an image of Scar transforming himself essentially first into Hitler, but because there's a lot of Nazi imagery in this particular clip, but also into a satanic figure. At the end you'll see he's associated with the crescent moon, so he turns into the horned demon of the night essentially. Now you can see that's all images of hell, obviously. See, one of the things that happened to people like Stalin, for example, is Stalin had nothing but contempt for people, and he thought all they ever did was lie. Well, what happened to Stalin is that he became surrounded by people to whom he could demonstrate contempt and who never did anything to him except lie. Because the reason for that was they were so terrified of him that they would never tell him the truth about anything. And so he got into this spiral, which is kind of the spiral of a paranoid psychopath, where I distrust you so badly and set things up so that you'll be punished so hard if you ever deviate from the appropriate line that you'll do nothing but lie to me. And so then I'm fully justified in my contempt. It's like Peter Pan in some sense, king of the lost boys. It's like, well, who do you want to be king of? Well, the route that Scar took, which is the negative archetype, the shadow route, means that he's king, but he's king of hell, and all he's got are these brainless minions. And so, he's king of people he wouldn't want to associate with. It's not exactly an attainment.
And where did we just listen to teacher? I know it sounds naughty, but you'll be rewarded. Last night I gave on my dues, and injustice deliciousness for the death of the king. How does he say? From where to kill him. Simba too. Idiots! There will be a king! I will be king! Stick with me, and you'll never go hungry again!
So you may remember, or you may not remember that, or you may not know that Hitler, of course, set up the biggest meeting arena that the world had ever seen for the Nuremberg Nazi Party rallies. And there's something to see. They were filmed quite brilliantly in a film called Will to Power. I think that's what it's called. Leni Riefenstahl. And What Hitler has arrayed in front of him are blocks of thousands of soldiers, everywhere, as far as you can see, in absolutely perfect uniformity. And that's the idea, because if you're already right, nothing has to be different. Everything can be the same as the perfect thing. The problem with that is you're not right, and things have to change. And Hitler, he was a master of the use of fire as well, and also put his displays on at night. And so he took all the Luftwaffe's aircraft spotting spotlights, which were huge, massive lights, maybe they must have been 20 feet across, and he had them all lined up behind him on the stage, and they would shine miles up into the sky. And so he would address these thousands and thousands of people in this nighttime ritual with a curtain of light behind him that was several miles high. It was an unbelievably powerful pageant, and the people who made this film are drawing on that to produce these images. You know, and modern people will say things like, well, the idea of hell is just a superstition. But then you watch this and it makes sense. And then you think, well, hell is where Satan himself rules and nothing happens but the bodies burn in death. And that's exactly what happened during the Holocaust. And so thinking that these sorts of archetypal ideas are superstitious it's extraordinarily foolish and naive, because they represent possibilities of being that continually manifest themselves, and everyone knows about them. So, you know, the implicit idea here is that if you take the path that Scar took, which is one of resentment and deceit as well as arrogance, which are three major shadow motivators, then you'll end up at best ruling over hell. And it's no joke. Like, it's not a superstition. The stories are trying to tell you something, that his mode of being is the pathway to perdition, and that the things that happen there are so terrible and so deep that the only way you can really express them is using the kind of imagery that we've come to associate with religious. And religious imagery, in a sense, is imagery that cannot be made more powerful. That's what makes it archetypal. It's like a limit. You can't go past it in terms of the representation. And so when you represent the ultimate destiny of evil as eternal hell, where all the bodies burn forever and there's nothing there except demonic chatter, that's about as far as you can go in terms of your capacity to represent something. But it's representing something. So when you can say, well, it's an eternal place, well, that's because this possibility is always there. It never goes away. It's always there. And that's also what makes it archetypal. And you know that because otherwise you wouldn't be able to understand the story. And everyone knows it. Otherwise this story wouldn't be, I still believe it's one of the top 10 grossing films of all time. So obviously it makes sense. Okay, well, I'd like to show you a lot more, but I can't. So we'll see you Thursday. I'm going to post some sample questions on the website very soon. Tonight, possibly, tomorrow morning, possibly, somewhere around there. So check it out, and you'll get some sense of what the exam's going to be like. So today we're going to talk about Freud. Freud is probably, perhaps, the most controversial of the psychological theorizers that we've been discussing in the first part of this course. I don't know what it is about Freud exactly. People really like to give him a rough time, even though it's quite clear that many of the things we take for granted as psychologists today were first introduced into the public realm of knowledge by Freud. Now, Freud would say that the reason that people are so upset with his theorizing is that they don't like the implications of what he says, and that he could have predicted that as a consequence of his theory, because Freud talks about things that people don't really like to talk about. And I think there's a lot of truth to that. I also think that Freud was one of those people who was right at some levels of analysis and not so right at others. But I would say that even where he wasn't right, he was helpfully wrong. And a theory can be helpfully wrong if it's better than the theory that it replaced. Just like a hammer is a better tool for chopping down a tree than a wrench. It's not as good as an axe, but if you conceptualize conceptual schemes as tools, then you can also understand how a better tool is an improvement, even though it's not necessarily right. And a lot of the clinical theories are quite tool-like, given that they're applied to the problems of poor mental health. So, and I don't really think of clinical psychology precisely as a science, because it's an applied science, and that makes it more like a form of engineering. I mean, it can be based on scientific insight, and it appropriately is, but it straddles, as we've discussed, the space between value and science. And so the theories have to be a hybrid, a strange hybrid. Now I'm going to play you a little recording, and this is the only recording that was ever made of Freud, strangely enough. I mean, the recording technology was there, but it's only 1 minute and 23 seconds long. So I'll play that, and then we'll do a fairly comprehensive job of walking through Freud's theory. And then on Tuesday, I'm going to show you some movie clips, because like as with Jung, one of the best ways to understand Freud is to actually see some examples of what he was talking about. Now, those examples are hard to come by, as it turns out, but I have a movie there is a movie, I should rephrase that does a great job of it, really a great job. So, okay, so here's the recording. Okay, so I'm going to give you some historical background so that you can understand the context within which Freud was operating. Now, the reason I'm going to do this, because you might think, well, why is the history necessary? And part of the reason it's necessary is because mental disorders, such as they are, have a sociological element. And so you might think about it this way. The human brain is obviously predisposed to learn languages. So there's a biological substrate for language learning. We don't really understand it. You can think of it as a capacity, although that doesn't help. But when you launch a baby into the world and the baby encounters a linguistic community, he or she learns to speak very, very rapidly. But the languages are different depending on the culture. And mental illnesses are like that. So you can think, well, there can be biological disruption at one level of analysis. Sorry about that, guys. There can be biological disruption at one level of analysis, and maybe that biological disruption in some sense is somewhat constant across cultures, but then the manner in which the disturbance manifests itself, the specific manner, is going to be shaped by the culture. And then, of course, and this is a Freudian idea, because culture battles against the individual to some degree, and so that's sort of the idea of the superego against the id, then the battle between the individual and culture is going to take forms that differ with the culture, because sometimes in some epochs there's going to be trouble in the society with regards to incorporating one set of drives, and other times there's going to be trouble incorporating another set of drives. And so for Freud, in Freud's time, sexuality was very problematic. I don't think it's exactly appropriate to say that it was repressed. I would say that more that it was extraordinarily problematic. And the reason for that is that sex is extraordinarily problematic for all sorts of reasons. One of the main reasons is, apart from pregnancy, apart from unwanted pregnancy, apart from the passions that sexual attraction inflames, it's also an incredibly effective vector for the transmission of disease. And so part of the reason that people have mixed motives and with regards to their sexual behavior is because, like eating, sex is one of those activities that can also potentially be contaminating. And one of the things that happened in the Victorian era was that when the Europeans came to North America, they carried a variety of different illnesses: measles, mumps, smallpox. Those were very, very hard on the Native American population and wiped about 95% of it out. There is a theory that syphilis was the reverse gift, and that it was brought to the old world by the new world. It was the only illness, as far as anyone knows, that had that particular characteristic. Anyways, it was a devastating illness, syphilis. I mean, it was certainly the syphilis problem in Europe in the late 1900s was certainly as serious as the AIDS crisis in the 20th century, which is still to some degree running out, especially in developing countries, but has been somewhat controlled. And so there were also very, very rigid gender roles, and that was pretty true, I would say, around the world until the 20th century, and probably really until the 1950s or thereabouts, because it was at the end of the 50s that the birth control pill was invented. And the birth control pill was what propelled the political movements that facilitated the movement of women into the workplace en masse by the 1970s. I mean, people like to attribute that to political pressure, but without the biological transformation, the political pressure would be pointless. So I think it's hard for modern people to understand how problematic sex was for the Victorians. There's a conflict between propagation of the species and the happiness and health of a particular individual. And it's a difficult problem to solve, especially because children are dependent for so long. So this is from Henri Allenberger, who wrote a great book. If you're really interested in psychoanalytic thought, this is the best book you can read as an introduction. It's called The Discovery of the Unconscious. And a lot of what I'm going to tell you about Freud, although I've read a fair bit of Freud, I took from the discovery of the unconscious, because it's regarded as the best scholarly work that was ever done on the history of the psychoanalytic movement, and also on Freud and Jung and Adler. And so Ellen Berger, who was an existential psychotherapist who lived in Montreal, at least when he was older, produced a very even-handed historical representation of the precursors to the idea of the unconscious, and then of Freud's theories and Jung's theories and Adler's theories. So here's what the world was like. It was a world shaped by man, for man, in which women occupied the second place. Political rights for women did not exist. The separation and dissimilarity of the sexes was sharper than today. Women who wore slacks or wore their hair short or smoked were hardly to be found. The universities admitted no female students until the early 1890s. Man's authority over his children and also over his wife was unquestioned. Education was authoritarian. The despotic father was a common figure and was particularly conspicuous only when he became extremely cruel. Laws were more repressive, delinquent youth sternly punished, and corporal punishment was considered indispensable. Sexual repression, a supposed characteristic of the Victorian psyche, was often merely the expression of two facts: the lack of diffusion of contraceptives and the fear of venereal disease. Now, there's another issue as well, because employment opportunities were extraordinarily limited for women for a variety of reasons. It was also very, very problematic if a woman became pregnant outside of wedlock. And the other thing that's really necessary to understand is that people in the late 1800s didn't have very much money. Even in the civilized world, so to speak, in the late 1800s, the average amount of money in today's terms that people lived on was about $1 a day. So it's almost impossible for us to imagine how much wealthier we are now than people were only 120 years ago. So there were three factors that made sexuality difficult to integrate. One was the sheer danger of pregnancy for women, and then disease, and then the fact associated with that there were no contraceptives. Venereal disease was all the more dangerous because of the great spread of prostitution, and because prostitutes were almost invariably contaminated and therefore potential sources of infection. We can hardly imagine today how monstrous syphilis appeared to people of that time, made worse by the fact that it was likely to be transmitted to the next generation in the form of hereditary syphilis, which in turn had become a nightmarish myth and to which many physicians attributed all diseases of unknown origin. Well, syphilis was and is a particularly problematic pathogen because it produces a massive range of symptoms. And so there's no telling what form it will necessarily take in one victim compared to another. So the Victorians had no shortage of reasons to be in serious conflict about sexuality. Now, Freud was also very much influenced by Nietzsche. Ellen Berger says that psychoanalysis belongs to that unmasking trend, the search for hidden unconscious motivations characteristic of the 1880s and 1890s. In Freud, as in Nietzsche, words and deeds are viewed as manifestations of unconscious motivations, mainly of instincts and conflicts of instincts. For both men, the unconscious is the realm of the wild, brutish instincts that cannot find permissible outlets, derived from earlier stages of the individual and of mankind, and find expression in passion, dreams, and mental illness. Now, it seems to me, and I don't know if it also seems to you, that these are sorts of things that we take for granted now, that people don't always say what they mean, that their speech and their actions are influenced by factors that they're not necessarily conscious of, that some of the drives or the motivational states that are characteristic of people influence the manner in which they speak, influence their dreams, and influence their actions in ways that are difficult to discover. And that passions and dreams and mental illnesses are manifestations of the unconscious. And so, you see, what happens to a thinker whose ideas are rapidly integrated into the culture, and that was the case with Freud, despite the fact that he said there was great resistance, and there was, but I mean, the ideas that he put forth were integrated into Western culture during his lifetime, which is staggeringly fast from a historical perspective. I mean, when you absorb a great thinker's ideas and those become axioms now, they're what people assume, then all that's really left of what they think is what's the error, right? Because the errors, of course, don't become incorporated, and then the thinker just gets blamed for his errors. So, and that's certainly something that happened to Freud. Even the term id, which actually means it, originates from Nietzsche. The dynamic concept of mind with the notions of mental energy, quanta of latent or inhibited energy, or release of energy, or transfer from one drive to another is also to be found in Nietzsche. Before Freud, Nietzsche conceived the mind as a system of drives that can collide or be fused into one another. In contrast to Freud, however, Nietzsche did not give prevalence to the sexual drive, whose importance he duly acknowledged, but to aggressive and self-destructive drives. Nietzsche also understood those processes that the Freudians called defense mechanisms, particularly sublimation. So, to sublimate something is to take a form of energy like sexual energy, let's say, and pour it into something else. Now, the sublimation idea is a very interesting one because for Freud it was more of an individual issue. So he thought of sexual energy, libido, as a kind of, in some sense, a free energy. It was a source of energy that the psyche could use. And because it was, in some sense, a free source of energy, it could be channeled into other activities. And so, you know, one of the obvious examples of that would be paintings of nudes, for example, or into creativity in general. And Freud actually believed that the reason that people became civilized was because we learned how to sublimate our instinctual energies into forms of activity and thought that were acceptable in the social community. Now, the funny thing about the idea of sublimation is that I think it actually works better as a phylogenetic hypothesis than as an ontogenetic hypothesis. So, and here's why. It is certainly the case that one of the reasons that people are creative, especially one of the reasons that men are creative, is because if a man is successfully creative and that makes him successful, the probability that he's going to have a wider choice of mates, or at least the possibility of what he might consider a higher quality mate, goes up immensely. And that's partly because women, unlike their closest biological relatives, which are the chimpanzees, are extremely selective